Chapter 7 of the Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, a Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Introduction. The Last Abbot of Whalley. Chapter 7 The Abbey Mill. For a while the abbot remained shattered and stupefied by this terrible interview. At length he arose, and made his way, he scarce knew how, to the oratory. But it was long before the tumult of his thoughts could be at all allayed, and he had only just regained something like composure, when he was disturbed by hearing a slight sound in the adjoining chamber. A mortal chill came over him, for he thought it might be Demdike returned. Presently he distinguished a footstep stealthily approaching him, and almost hoped that the wizard would consummate his vengeance by taking his life. But he was quickly undeceived, for a hand was placed on his shoulder, and a friendly voice whispered in his ear, "Come along with me, Lord Abbot. Get up, quick, quick." Thus addressed, the abbot raised his eyes, and beheld a rustic figure standing beside him, divested of his clouted shoes, and armed with a long bare wood knife. "Dunna you know me, Lord Abbot?" cried the person. "I'm a friend, Hal Nabs o' Wiswall. You mind Wiswall, your own birthplace, Abbot? Dunna be feart, I say. I'm getten a stay clapt to yon window, and yo can be down it i' a trice, and along t' covered way by t' river side to t' mill." But the abbot stirred not. "Quick, quick!" implored Hal o' Nabs, venturing to pluck the abbot's sleeve. "Every minute's precious. Dunna be feart. Abel Croft, t' miller, is below. Poor Cuthbert Ashbead would ha' been here i'stead o' me if he could ha', but that accursed wizard, Nick Demdike, turned my hunt agen him, and drove t' pike head intended for himself into poor Cuthbert's side. They clapped me i' a dungeon, but Abel managed to get me out, and I then swore to do what poor Cuthbert would ha' done if he had been living. So here I am, Lord Abbot, come to set you free. Now you know all about it, you can ha' no more hesitation. Come, time presses, and I'm feared that God overhearing us." "I thank you, my good friend, from the bottom of my heart," replied the abbot, rising. "But however strong may be the temptation of life and liberty which you hold out to me, I cannot yield to it. I have pledged my word to the Earl of Derby to make no attempt to escape. Were the doors thrown open and the guard removed, I should remain where I am." "What!" exclaimed Hal o' Nabs, in a tone of bitter disappointment, "you winna go now I was prepared? By t' mess, but you shan. Ey'st ne'er go back to Abel empty handed. If yo'n sworn to stay here, ey'n sworn to set you free, and ey'st keep my oath. Willy nilly, you shan go wi' me, Lord Abbot." "Forbear to urge me further, my good Hal," rejoined Paslew. "I fully appreciate your devotion, and I only regret that you and Abel Croft have exposed yourself to so much peril on my account. Poor Cuthbert Ashbead! When I beheld his body on the bier, I had a sad feeling that he had died on my behalf." "Cuthbert meant to rescue you, Lord Abbot," replied Hal, "and died resisting Nick Demdike's attempt to arrest him. Be ye aught devils?" he added, brandishing his knife fiercely. "Th' warlock shall ha' 3 inches of cold steel twixt his ribs th' first time I come across him." "Peace, my son," rejoined the abbot, "and forego your bloody design. Leave the wretched man to the chastisement of Heaven. And now farewell. All your kindly efforts to induce me to fly are vain." "You winna go?" cried Hal o' Nabs, scratching his head. "I cannot," replied the abbot. "Come wi' me to t' window, then," pursued Hal, "and tell Abel so. He'll think I'm failed else." "Willingly," replied the abbot. And with noiseless footsteps he followed the other across the chamber. The window was open, and outside it was reared a ladder. "You mun go down a few steps," said Hal o' Nabs, "or else he'll na hear you." The abbot complied, and partly descended the ladder. "I see no one," he said. "It's dark," replied Hal o' Nabs, who was close behind him. "Abel canna be far off. At least I hear him. Go on." The abbot was now obliged to comply, though he did so with reluctance. Presently he found himself upon the roof of a building, which he knew to be connected with the mill by a covered passage running along the south bank of the Calder. Scarcely had he set foot there than Hal o' Nabs jumped after him, and, seizing the ladder, cast it into the stream, thus rendering Paslew's return impossible. "Now, lord abbot," he cried, with a low exulting laugh, "yo hanna broken your word, and ey'n kept mine. Yo're free agin your will." "You have destroyed me by your mistaken zeal," cried the abbot, reproachfully. "Nowt o' th' sort. Ey'n saved yo from destruction. This way, lord abbot, this way." And taking Paslew's arm, he led him to a low parapet, overlooking the covered passage before described. Half an hour before, it had been bright moonlight, but, as if to favour the fugitive, the heavens had become overcast, and a thick mist had arisen from the river. "Abel, Abel!" cried Hal o' Nabs, leaning over the parapet. "Here," replied a voice below. "Is aw reet? Is he wi' you?" "Yeigh," replied Hal. "What han ye done wi' t' stay?" cried Abel. "Never yo mind," returned Hal, "boh help t' abbot down." Paslew thought it vain to resist further, and with the help of Hal o' Nabs and the miller, and further aided by some irregularities in the wall, he was soon safely landed near the entrance of the passage. Abel fell on his knees, and pressed the abbot's hand to his lips. "Oh, blessed Lady be praised, you're free!" he cried. "Dunna stand talking there, Abel," interposed Hal o' Nabs, who by this time had reached the ground, and who was fearful of some new remonstrance on the abbot's part. "I'm feared o' pursuit." "Yo needna be feared o' that, Hal," replied the miller. "T' gardener's safe enough. One o' our chaps has just took 'em up a big black jack full o' stout ale, an ey warrant me they winna stay here awhile. Win it please yo to come wi' me, lord abbot?" With this he marched along the passage, followed by the others, and presently arrived at a door, against which he tapped. A bolt being withdrawn, it was instantly opened to admit the party, after which it was as quickly shut and secured. In answer to a call from the miller, a light appeared at the top of a steep ladder like flight of wooden steps, and up these Paslew, at the entreaty of Abel, mounted, and found himself in a large low chamber, the roof of which was crossed by great beams, covered thickly with cobwebs, whitened by flour, while the floor was strewn with empty sacks and sieves. The person who held the light proved to be the miller's daughter, Dorothy, a blooming lass of 18, and at the other end of the chamber, seated on a bench before a turf fire, with an infant on her knees, was the miller's wife. The latter instantly arose on beholding the abbot, and placing the child on a corn bin, advanced towards him and dropped on her knees, while her daughter imitated her example. The abbot extended his hands over them, and pronounced a solemn benediction. "Bring your child also to me, that I may bless it," he said, when he concluded. "It's no my child, lord abbot," replied the miller's wife, taking up the infant and bringing it to him. "It were brought to me this very neet by Abel. I wish it were fair enough, I'm sure, for it's a deformed little urchin. One of the eyes is lower set than t'other, and reet looks up, while left looks down." And as she spoke, she pointed to the infant's face, which was disfigured, as she had stated, by a strange and unnatural disposition of the eyes, one of which was set much lower in the head than the other. Awakened from sleep, the child uttered a feeble cry, and stretched out its tiny arms to Dorothy. "You ought to pity it for its deformity, poor little creature, rather than to reproach it, mother," observed the young damsel. "Marry, come out," cried her mother, sharply. "Yo'n getten fine feelings wi' your learning fro' t' good feythers, Dolly, and ey said before ey wished the brat were far enough." "You forget it has no mother," suggested Dorothy, kindly. "And no matter if it hasn't," returned the miller's wife. "Bess Demdike's no great loss." "Is this Bess Demdike's child?" cried Paslew, recoiling. "Yea," exclaimed the miller's wife; and, mistaking the cause of Paslew's emotion, she added triumphantly to her daughter, "Ey towd te, wench, that Lort Abbut would be o' my way o' thinkin'. T' chilt has got witch's mark plain upon her. Look, Lort Abbut, look!" But Paslew heeded her not, but murmured to himself, "Ever in my path, go where I will, it is vain to struggle with my fate. I will go back and surrender myself to the Earl of Derby." "Nay, nay, yo shanna do that," replied Hal o' Nabs, who, with the miller, was close beside him. "Sit down o' that stoo by the fire, and take a cup o' wine to cheer you, and then we'll set out to Pendle Forest, where I s' find yo a safe hiding place. And t' onny reward ey never ask for t' service shan be that yo'n perform a marriage service for me and Dolly one o' these days." And he nudged the damsel's elbow, who turned away, covering with blushes. The abbot moved mechanically to the fire, and sat down, while the miller's wife, surrendering the child with a shrug of the shoulders and a grimace to her daughter, went in search of some viands and a flask of wine, which she set before Paslew. The miller then filled a drinking horn, and presented it to his guest, who was about to raise it to his lips, when a loud knocking was heard at the door below. The knocking continued with increased violence, and voices were heard calling upon the miller to open the door, or it would be broken down. On the first alarm, Abel had flown to a small window, whence he could reconnoitre those below, and he now returned with a face white with terror, to say that a party of arquebussiers, with the sheriff at their head, were without, and that some of the men were provided with torches. "They have discovered my evasion, and are come in search of me," observed the abbot, rising, but without betraying any anxiety. "Do not concern yourselves further for me, my good friends, but open the door and deliver me to them." "Nah, nah, that we winna," cried Hal o' Nabs. "Yo're no ta'en yet, Feyther Abbut, and I know a way to baffle 'em. If yo'n let him down into t' river, Ebil, I'll manage to get him off." "Weel thowt on't, Nab," cried the miller. "Theawst na been my mon 7 year for nowt. Theaw knowst ways o' t' pleck." "Os weel as onny rotten about it," replied Hal o' Nabs. "Go down to t' grinding room, and ey'n follow here trice." And as Abel snatched up the light, and hastily descended the steps with Paslew, Hal whispered in Dorothy's ears, "Tak care now no one fonds that chilt, Dolly. If they break in, hide it safely, and when they're gone, take it to t' church, and place it near t' altar, where no ill can come to it or thee. Thy life may hong upon it." And as the poor girl, who, as well as her mother, was almost frightened out of her wits, promised compliance, he hurried down the steps after the others, muttering, as the clamour without was redoubled, "Eh, roar on till you're hoarse. You winna get in yet awhile, ey promise you." Meanwhile, the abbot had been led to the chief room of the mill, where all the corn formerly consumed within the monastery had been prepared, and which the size of the chamber itself, together with the vastness of the stones used in the operation of grinding, and connected with the huge water wheel outside, proved to be by no means inconsiderable. Strong shafts of timber supported the flooring above, and were crossed by other boards placed horizontally, from which various implements in use at the mill depended, giving the chamber, imperfectly lighted as it now was by the lamp borne by Abel, a strange and almost mysterious appearance. 3 or 4 of the miller's men, armed with pikes, had followed their master, and, though much alarmed, they vowed to die rather than to give up the abbot. By this time Hal o' Nabs had joined the group, and proceeding towards a raised part of the chamber, where the grinding stones were set, he knelt down, and, laying hold of a small ring, raised up a trap door. The fresh air which blew up through the aperture, combined with the rushing sound of water, showed that the Calder flowed immediately beneath, and, having made some slight preparation, Hal let himself down into this stream. At this moment a loud crash was heard, and one of the miller's men cried out that the arquebussiers had burst open the door. "Be on thee then, lads, and let him down," cried Hal o' Nabs, who had some difficulty in maintaining his footing on the rough stony bottom of the swift stream. Passively yielding, the abbot suffered the miller and one of the stoutest of his men to assist him through the trap door, while a third held down the lamp, and showed Hal o' Nabs up to his middle in the darkling current, and stretching out his arms to receive the burden. The light fell upon the huge black circle of the water wheel, now stopped, and upon the dripping arches supporting the mill. In another moment the abbot plunged into the water. The trapdoor was replaced and bolted underneath by Hal, who, while guiding his companion along, and bidding him catch hold of the woodwork of the wheel, heard a heavy trampling of many feet on the boards above, showing that the pursuers had obtained admittance. Encumbered by his heavy vestments, the abbot could with difficulty contend against the strong current, and he momently expected to be swept away; but he had a stout and active assistant by his side, who soon placed him under shelter of the wheel. The trampling overhead continued for a few minutes, after which all was quiet, and Hal judged that, finding their search within ineffectual, the enemy would speedily come forth. Nor was he deceived. Shouts were soon heard at the door of the mill, and the glare of torches was cast on the stream. Then it was that Hal dragged his companion into a deep hole, formed by some decay in the masonry behind the wheel, where the water rose nearly to their chins, and where they were completely concealed. Scarcely were they thus ensconced, than 2 or 3 armed men, holding torches aloft, were seen wading under the archway; but after looking carefully around, and even approaching close to the water wheel, these persons could detect nothing, and withdrew, muttering curses of rage and disappointment. By and by the lights almost wholly disappeared, and the shouts becoming fainter and more distant, it was evident that the men had gone lower down the river. Upon this, Hal thought that they might venture to quit their retreat, and accordingly, grasping the abbot's arm, he proceeded to wade up the stream. Benumbed with cold, and half dead with terror, Paslew needed all his companion's support, for he could do little to help himself; added to which, they occasionally encountered some large stone, or stepped into a deep hole, so that it required Hal's utmost exertion and strength to force a way on. At last they were out of the arch, and though both banks seemed unguarded, yet, for fear of surprise, Hal deemed it prudent still to keep to the river. Their course was completely sheltered from observation by the mist that enveloped them, and after proceeding in this way for some distance, Hal stopped to listen, and while debating with himself whether he should now quit the river, he fancied he beheld a black object swimming towards him. Taking it for an otter, with which voracious animal the Calder, a stream swarming with trout, abounded, and knowing the creature would not meddle with them unless first attacked, he paid little attention to it; but he was soon made sensible of his error. His arm was suddenly seized by a large black hound, whose sharp fangs met in his flesh. Unable to repress a cry of pain, Hal strove to disengage himself from his assistant, and finding it impossible, flung himself into the water in the hope of drowning him. But as the hound still maintained his hold, he searched for his knife to slay him, but he could not find it, and in his distress applied to Paslew. "Have you any weapon about you, lord abbot," he cried, "with which I can free myself from this accursed hound?" "Alas! no, my son," replied Paslew, "and I fear no weapon will prevail against it, for I recognise in the animal the hound of the wizard Demdike." "I thought the deil were in it," rejoined Hal; "but leave me to find it out, and do you get bunk, and make best of your way to Wiswall. I'll join you as soon as I can crush this varmint's head again a stone. Ah!" he added joyfully, "I'll part Twittle. Go, go! I'll soon be after you." Feeling he should sink if he remained where he was, and wholly unable to offer any effectual assistance to his companion, the abbot turned to the left, where a large oak overhung the stream, and he was climbing the bank, aided by the roots of the tree, when a man suddenly came from behind it, seized his hand, and dragged him up forcibly. At the same moment his captor placed a bugle to his lips, and winding a few notes, he was instantly answered by shouts, and soon afterwards half a dozen armed men ran up, bearing torches. Not a word passed between the fugitive and his captor, but when the men came up, and the torchlight fell upon the features of the latter, the abbot's worst fears were realised. It was Demdike. "False to your king, false to your oath, false to all men," cried the wizard, "you seek to escape in vain." "I merit all your reproaches," replied the abbot. But it may be some satisfaction to you to learn that I have endured far greater suffering than if I had patiently awaited my doom." "I am glad of it," rejoined Demdike, with a savage laugh. "But you have destroyed others besides yourself. Where is the fellow in the water? What ho, Uriel!" But as no sound reached him, he snatched a torch from one of the arquebussiers, and held it to the river's brink. But he could see neither hound nor man. "Strange!" he cried. "He cannot have escaped. Uriel is more than a match for any man. Secure the prisoner while I examine the stream." With this he ran along the bank with great quickness, holding his torch far above the water, so as to reveal anything floating within it. But nothing met his view until he came within a short distance of the mill, when he beheld a black object struggling in the current, and soon found that it was his dog, making feeble efforts to gain the bank. "Ah, recreant, thou hast let him go!" cried Demdike, furiously. Seeing his master, the animal redoubled his efforts, crept ashore, and fell at his feet with a last effort to lick his hands. Demdike held down the torch, and then perceived that the hound was quite dead. There was a deep gash in its side, and another in the throat, showing how it had perished. "Poor Uriel!" he exclaimed, "the only true friend I had, and thou art gone. The villain has killed thee, but he shall pay for it with his life." And hurrying back, he despatched 4 of the men in quest of the fugitive, while, accompanied by 2 others, he conveyed Paslew back to the Abbey, where he was placed in a strong cell, from which there was no possibility of escape, and a guard was set over him. Half an hour after this, 2 of the arquebussiers returned with Hal o' Nabs, whom they had succeeded in capturing after a desperate resistance, about a mile from the Abbey, on the road to Wiswall. He was taken to the guard room, which had been appointed in one of the lower chambers of the chapter house, and Demdike was immediately apprised of his arrival. Satisfied by an inspection of the prisoner, whose demeanour was sullen and resolved, Demdike proceeded to the great hall, where the Earl of Derby, who had returned thither after the midnight mass, was still sitting with his retainers. An audience was readily obtained by the wizard, and, apparently well pleased with the result, he returned to the guard room. The prisoner was seated by himself in one corner of the chamber, with his hands tied behind his back with a leathern thong, and Demdike, approaching him, told him that, for having aided the escape of a condemned rebel and traitor, and violently assaulting the king's lieges in the execution of their duty, he would be hanged on the morrow, the Earl of Derby, who had the power of life or death in such cases, having so decreed it, and he exhibited the warrant. "So you mean to hang me, wizard?" cried Hal o' Nabs, kicking his heels with great apparent indifference. "I do," replied Demdike, "if for nothing else, for slaying my hound." "I dunna think it," replied Hal. "Yo're not i' your mind, demon. I'm na prepared to dee just yet." "Then perish in your sins," cried Demdike. "I will not give you an hour's respite." "Yo'n be sorry when it's too late," said Hal. "Tush!" cried Demdike. "My only regret will be that Uriel's slaughter is paid for by such a worthless life as thine." "Then why take it?" demanded Hal, "specially when yo'n lose your child by doing so." "My child!" exclaimed Demdike, surprised. "How mean you, sirrah?" "I mean this," replied Hal, coolly, "that if I die to morrow morning, your child dies too. When I undertook this job, I calculated my chances, and took precautions aforehand. Your child's a hostage for my safety." "Curses on thee and thy cunning!" cried Demdike. "But I will not be outwitted by a hind like thee. I will have the child, and yet not be baulked of my revenge." "Yo'll never ha' it, except as a breathless corpse, bout my consent," rejoined Hal. "We shall see," cried Demdike, rushing forth, and bidding the guards look well to the prisoner. But ere long he returned with a gloomy and disappointed expression of countenance, and again approaching the prisoner, said, "Thou hast spoken the truth. The infant is in the hands of some innocent being over whom I have no power." "Ey towd thee so, wizard," replied Hal, laughing. "Hoind os ey be, ey'm a match for thee. Ha! ha! Now, mere life against child. Wilt yo set me free?" Demdike deliberated. "Harkee, wizard," cried Hal. "If yo're hatching treason, ey'n done. Certainty o' revenge will sweeten my last moments." "Will you swear to deliver the child to me unharmed, if I set you free?" asked Demdike. "It's a bargain, wizard," replied Hal o' Nabs. "Ey swear. Boh yo mun set me free first, for ey winna tak your word." Demdike turned away disdainfully, and addressing the arquebussiers, said, "You behold this warrant, guard. The prisoner is now committed to my custody. I will produce him on the morrow, or account for his absence to the Earl of Derby." One of the arquebussiers examined the order, and vouching for its correctness, the others signified their assent to the arrangement, upon which Demdike motioned the prisoner to follow him, and quitted the chamber. No interruption was offered to Hal's egress, but he stopped within the courtyard, where Demdike awaited him, and unfastened the leathern thong that bound together his hands. "Now go and bring the child to me," said the wizard. "Neaw, ey ne'er bring it to ye myself," rejoined Hal. "Ey knost better than that. But at t' church porch in half an hour, and t' bantlin shall be delivered to ye safe and sound." And without waiting for a reply, he ran off with great swiftness. At the appointed time, Demdike sought the church, and as he drew near it, there issued from the porch a female, who, hastily placing the child, wrapped in a mantle, in his arms, tarried for no speech from him, but instantly disappeared. Demdike, however, recognised in her the miller's daughter, Dorothy Croft. CHAPTER VIII.